Final Systems White Paper, 2025 NFL Systems Model. A structural, matchup-aware framework for offense-to-defense viability. This white paper presents a unified systems model for NFL team performance that treats football as an interaction of structural ecosystems rather than isolated statistics. The core claim is that sustainable offensive success is best explained by a small set of stable cross-domain leverage drivers: passing depth, receiving leverage conversion, rushing leverage, and protection stability. While defensive success is best explained by explosive suppression and coverage compression more than raw pressure volume. The model is explicitly matchup-aware. Because defensive shells and coverage backbones drift over time, offensive identity must be evaluated relative to defensive archetype exposure, not through static efficiency rankings. Data foundations and verification. The model is built from your integrated NGS plus PFF ecosystem stack and is designed to be robust to common pitfalls: small sample artifacts, mechanically coupled totals, and nonlinear-only spurious correlations. At the quarterback layer, you constructed a combined correlation system across 33 quarterback seasons, producing an 823 by 823 full matrix and a 141 by 141 clean combined matrix with 9,870 valid stat pairs, enabling expected co-movement diagnostics across pressure, depth, and efficiency variables. At the defensive layer, your verified NGS coverage and pass rush pipeline removed corrupted inputs and normalized team keys, producing clean player-level and team-level correlation outputs suitable for descriptive modeling and feature selection. At the cross-domain offense layer, your correlation consistency report shows Pearson and Spearman agreement and identifies 110 stable cross-domain relationships, supporting the claim that the dominant structural signals are not artifacts of one correlation method. Structural Principle 1. Offense is a leverage ecosystem, not a pass versus run split. Across passing, rushing, and receiving, the stable signal is ecosystem alignment rather than single-domain strength. Your cross-domain stability work demonstrates that passing and receiving co-move tightly. For example, average depth of target aligns strongly with team receiving average depth of target, and yards per attempt aligns with team yards per route run, indicating that passing efficiency cannot be separated from receiving structure. Rushing efficiency is also not independent. It co-moves with receiving explosiveness measures such as yards per reception, implying that box stress and vertical stress reinforce each other rather than operating in isolation. A distinct extension ecosystem exists as well, where scramble and quarterback run variables form a stable cluster, implying that some offenses generate value through time and movement rather than clean pocket timing. Structural Principle 2. Protection is the upstream gatekeeper. Protection is not simply correlated with winning. It determines which offensive identity can exist at all. When protection stability is absent, deep rates compress, intermediate windows shrink, scramble dependency rises, and sack variance increases, producing volatility even when a team has flashes of ceiling. This is supported by your framework-level chargers diagnosis, where pressure control and stability are both bottom tier while run leverage is top 5, showing that a viable run engine can still coexist with a structurally unstable passing ecosystem if the pressure environment is not controlled. Your quarterback correlation guide reinforces why this matters. Intermediate efficiency is strongly tied to overall expected points added per dropback, while deep efficiency acts more like ceiling variance and is sensitive to the time and window environment created by protection and structure. Structural Principle 3. Defense is primarily explosive suppression and coverage compression. Defense reduces into two dominant axes: coverage volume and explosive suppression on one axis, and pass-rush disruption on the other. Your verified defensive research shows that coverage is composed of a mechanical exposure chain, targets to receptions to yards allowed, and a quality chain driven by spacing and window difficulty, separation allowed, and tight window rate. Pass-rush metrics form a mechanical subsystem. Pass-rush opportunities, pressures, quick pressures, and sacks. But sacks are downstream finishing rather than the primary mechanism of suppression. At the team level, the strongest cross-domain defensive relationship is that separation and tight window rate behave as inverse spacing measures, and damage conversion is carried by yards per target and touchdowns per target. The consequence is that pressure alone does not define coverage quality. Pressure modifies outcomes, but space compression and explosive containment are upstream determinants of defensive expected points added. Structural Principle 4. Scheme posterior drift makes viability dynamic. Defensive identity is not static across the season. Your fast-moving scheme posterior framework is designed to update coverage family and shell beliefs using verified NGS-derived evidence, separation, tight window rate, completion rate over expected, pressure rates, and related indicators, producing rolling posteriors that capture backbone and shell drift. This matters because deep heavy offenses are shell sensitive, intermediate heavy offenses are pressure sensitive, and extension offenses are disguise sensitive. When a defense drifts toward cover 4 and middle of field closed shells, vertical leverage compresses and offenses must win with intermediate precision under tighter windows. When a defense leans cover 3 or middle of field open, vertical window access increases and deep-oriented archetypes can spike. The defensive compression engine and matchup viability. The operational centerpiece of the model is a defensive compression engine that quantifies how much a defense structurally compresses an offense's leverage profile. Mechanistically, compression is composed of explosive suppression, driven by spacing control and damage conversion metrics. Coverage volume pressure, driven by exposure/allowance structure. Shell compression, from posterior shell/backbone beliefs. And pressure velocity as a modifier. Your verified defensive work supports the underlying components. Spacing stress, separation, and tight window rate is an upstream coverage control knob, and disruption is a mechanical cluster that amplifies but does not replace coverage compression. From there, matchup viability becomes computable rather than narrative. Offensive identity score, depth distribution, and intermediate reliance is multiplied by a protection stability multiplier and a receiving leverage score, then adjusted by defensive compression and shell compatibility. This turns the ecosystem model into a functional simulator. The same offense can have materially different viability profiles depending on whether the opponent is high compression, space suppressing plus MOFC, or low compression, more open shells plus weaker explosive suppression. Chargers case study. Coherent signals, single structural bottleneck. The Chargers diagnosis is internally consistent across independent model layers. Your cross-domain report finds that the Chargers are top 5 in run leverage, but bottom 2 in pressure control and stability, producing an overall meta-identity score in the high 20s. Your defensive descriptive report places the Chargers' defense in a pressure-dependent bucket with very high blitz exposure and decent pressure creation, but weaker conversion into high-damage outcomes. The unifying interpretation is that the Chargers' offensive ceiling exists, but their ecosystem is structurally unstable because pressure environment control is the gating variable. Improving protection stability would cascade into intermediate efficiency, reduced scramble dependence, and increased portability across defensive shell drift. Implementation path: from research to operating system. This stack is designed to be operationalized. The quarterback co-movement engine becomes a post-game diagnostic layer. If expected, linked metrics do not co-move after a game, it flags unusual opponent effects, game plan distortions, or explosive-driven variance rather than stable efficiency. The defensive posterior update system becomes a living scouting layer that shifts priors as new evidence arrives, enabling opponent scouting cards that reflect drift rather than stale assumptions. The defensive compression engine becomes a weekly dashboard that produces an opponent compression score, shell posterior, pressure velocity profile, and an offensive compatibility tilt recommendation. The receiver archetype and efficiency modeling layers become roster levers. They distinguish whether a team's receiving EPA is deployment inflated or truly efficiency driven, which is essential for acquisition and usage decisions. Limitations and guardrails. Several limitations remain by design. Correlations are descriptive and do not prove causation, especially when game state, opponent strength, and situational usage confound. Team-level defensive interaction analysis is sensitive to sample size when the verified set is limited. The model correctly emphasizes robust filtering and quality checks to prevent parsing artifacts from creating false structure. Finally, shell posterior confidence is lower than coverage family posterior confidence because shell inference often relies more heavily on proxies. It is still useful, but should be weighted accordingly. Conclusion: this model reframes football as a coherent structural system. Offense is a leverage ecosystem whose stability depends on protection and whose ceiling depends on depth and receiving leverage conversion. Defense is primarily space compression and explosive suppression, with pass rush acting as a modifier that accelerates disruption rather than serving as the root suppression mechanism. Scheme drift makes everything dynamic, turning viability into a matchup-aware quantity rather than a static team rank. Your ecosystem is coherent because the same structural story emerges across cross-domain correlation stability, quarterback co-movement physics, verified defensive coverage pass rush interactions, and the Chargers' meta-identity profile.